Hi, I'm Rob King and welcome to the retrospective on the American Cream Ale. Look at that, isn't that amazing? It's actually been a couple of months since we brewed this one, so we are going today to go through a re-evaluation, a look over the vital statistics, a deep dive on the schedule. This one was complicated. I needed a flow chart to run me through it. We're also going to have a look at the costs and the price per pint. Very important to me indeed. And then we'll see exactly how it stacks up against all the other homebrews this year. Finishing off with the lessons learned. Let's check it all out. We are starting then with the re-evaluation. Now this is the actual without lime version, lovely and cold, lovely and clear. The clarity has maintained and that is absolutely wonderful. It has a lovely creamy head which has evaporated a bit today while I've been setting up. The aroma too. Now it has a lovely aroma. Now it probably is driven by that maize, that really does come through. No hops, probably the barley and the malt, but honestly, wonderful, wonderful, wonderful aroma. Let's give it a try. This has been one of the best homebrews of this year, most certainly. Carbonation remains good, though in the bottle it has eased off a little from earlier on, but that doesn't change the flavour. The flavour still remains the winner. This is very, very nice indeed. We'll see where it ranks against all of the others in just a moment. Which brings us on to the vital statistics. Brewhouse efficiency came in at 68% versus a target of 65%, which was great. It was that mash efficiency though that came in far, far too high. And we talked about this last time. I do think it's because I take a sample from the grain bed itself and I need to actually take it somewhere that's a little bit more dilute in terms of the liquid. We'll work on that next time. ABV came in just a touch below what we was expecting, 4.8% versus a target of 5.1. Not too bad, but this was all driven from the fact we accidentally stalled the fermentation. We stuck at 1.013 and the target was 1.009. The fermenter volume, as you'd expect, was dead on target. The bottle volume was higher than expected, and this was partially driven, I think, from the fact that we added additional liquid in the lime juice. Now it doesn't account for the whole difference, but it does account for some of it. All the other factors remained in range. This is a highly carbonated drink, hence the additional sugars. Nice. If I ignore the rather chaotic start, things generally went to plan, with 7 days in primary and secondary, 7 days to carbonate, and then an extra 14 days for the bottles to carbonate, allowing us to start tasting on day 15. It was the fact that we hit 1.019 gravity at 3 AM in the morning as the Kvike yeast burned through fermentation that I didn't quite keep up with the fact that it wasn't 2 days in primary, and in fact it was less than 1 day. But what about the costs and the price per pint? Starting with the cost, the total cost was £48.30. This was high by my standards, and that breaks down largely as follows. Water accounts for 13% at £6.09. The grains 25% at £12.05. Hops came in at 12% at a cost of £5.96. Yeast, of course, which was a little expensive, came in at 21%, almost as much as the grains, at £10.41. Then we had some other additions like water chemistry, which we'll come back to in a moment. And then finally, the big cost, 25%, £11.99, was the purchase of that lime juice, which we only used in half of the batch. Looking at the breakdown in a bit more detail and starting with the bottled water, which is of course a personal choice, it does give me the opportunity though to really understand the water chemistry and then do additions on top of that. So I do prefer it, but tap water is an option if it's okay in your area. The grains then, compared to some of the other recipes we've done this year, were quite different, with the inclusion of Golden Promise as really the core base malt, and then followed by maize, which really I think gives it some of its flavour. Clarity, unbelievable. The hops then was Saaz and Centennial. Now the Saaz was interesting because the AA was so low. We'll come back to that in the lessons learned. Yeast then was that slightly expensive Kveik Lutra, which we used in the main pitching. Then we tried to reinvigorate the fermentation at the end and didn't really help with some Kveik Voss that I had in stock. Other costs then, which I referred to in that original breakdown, came in at £1.81, and this was mostly the water chemistry and also the yeast and yeast nutrient. There was also a little bit of lactic acid in there because we needed to do a pH adjustment. Finally, we have a miscellaneous other cost, which was the lime puree, which came in at £11.99. Now, depending on how you look at this, depends on what the price per pint comes out at, because I've allocated the entire cost to the whole batch. Now, there is a little bit more to it than that, but let's start with that price per pint, which was £1.83. Now, this is a little more on the expensive side, but that was driven up by that expensive lime juice. Now, since I have all of the data, I have run a couple of scenarios. So for example, if we were to have just done this batch without lime, the total cost would have come in at £36.31 and a cost per pint at £1.41. So this would have been a pretty reasonable price per pint. Now, if we did a full batch that was all with lime, so all of the costs went into that, that would have come out at £1.87 per pint and £48.30, pretty much as we saw in the existing calculation. Now, we could adjust that original calculation to just allocate the amount of lime that we really needed for the half a batch, and then that comes in at £1.59 per pint and a cost of £40.87. It really was the lime that pushed up the costs, and I think there are probably a couple of variations of pureeing the lime yourself, which have probably given a little bit more of a complex flavour. But where does that leave us with the ranking? And because we really had two batches in one, I couldn't really do one ranking, I had to rank them both. Starting with this one, where did that go? The ranking for this comes in third place overall, but an equal second place for all of the homebrews this year. A well-deserved win for the American Cream Ale. That seems perfect timing to reevaluate the with lime. Still a haze, but you can see clarity is much better. Which gives us the opportunity to re-evaluate the American Cream Ale with lime. Now, head retention has been a little bit less, but what has dramatically improved is the level of clarity. Now, it's probably hard to see in that shot, but if you switch back to the pour, you can see just how much that has improved over the intervening time. Aroma too, definitely have that citrus, not specifically lime, but very citrusy aroma to it, which does overpower some of that original corn and barley aromas. Still very nice though. The carbonation too remains excellent. This is a highly carbonated drink, and that definitely comes through in the with lime. Instantly, lots of lime flavour in the mouth. It really does overpower the other flavours, and I think we just overdid it on that front. Nonetheless, if you are a lager with lime fan, then actually it's about the right amount. Definitely quaffable, definitely just for me, and touch too much lime. We got ourselves slightly sidetracked there, but it does bring us back to the evaluation, and where does this rank overall? And it comes in a joint 5th/6th place alongside the Philly Sour. Very, very deserving of a good result, just not quite as good as the version without lime. Nice though. Right then, let's get on with the lessons learned. Lesson number 1 are those Saaz hops. Now, first up, Saaz were quite hard to get hold of, and those that you could had a very low alpha acid, things really have been tough for SARS recently. The original recipe reported SARS are coming in at roughly 5% alpha acids, and the version that we had to adjust for only came in at 1.7% AA. Lesson number 2 refers to the preparations in advance and the fact that I prepared the water chemicals also in advance. Overnight they must have become damp somehow. I need to be a bit more careful about that. Maybe I leave them in the fridge or cover them more. I don't know what I did wrong exactly, but they were a bit lumpy when I poured them in, and I needed to give it a good mix to break them back up and dissolve them in the water. My mistake, one to watch out for. Lesson number 3 is the grain water retention. Now, according to Brewfather, it should have retained about 2 litres of water, and the reality was it retained only 1 litre, so I could make an adjustment for that. And it does explain some of the water differences throughout the whole thing. However, I'm not sure it's quite as much as a whole litre difference. So if I do make an adjustment, I think I'm going to reduce it by about half of that, just half a litre maybe, in the first instance. Lesson number 4, this was also the first recipe I've come across that used sodium metabisulfate, or Camden tablets in other words. Now, the amount that the recipe called for was almost exactly 2 Camden tablets, so I added those, but it was unusual to see this as part of the overall recipe. Lesson number 5 are the Digiboil power settings, which at mash out I have previously overshot massively. Now on screen you can see all of the red markers are the power settings I used for the cream ale to power up at different stages or power down. To achieve the 75 degrees centigrade mash out temperature, I heated at 1900 watts up to 70 degrees centigrade and then dropped the power to 500 watts to bring it up to 75. This was only partially successful as I hit 77 degrees centigrade, but that was much closer than previously, so I am now within a couple of degrees of getting the power correct for the mash out temperature. Lesson number 6 is the post-mash volume. Now, I have been monitoring this really closely in both this recipe and the previous recipe, the ordinary bitter, to track it all through, as you can see in the table on the side. Now, what we're seeing is roughly a 1 litre difference throughout, but it's not that clear cut, because although if you compare start to finish, we did end up with a litre difference, we did still end up with the right amount in the fermenter. So there's a little bit more monitoring to do, I think, on this point. Lesson number 7 was that puree versus juice. Now, I thought I'd actually purchased lime puree. That turned out to be wrong. If it had been lime puree, I should have added 380 grams. In the end, I scaled it down a little bit and just added 350 milliliters, which was also still a little bit strong. Now, from the recipe, lime puree is more complex, adds more flavors, but perhaps not such a strong acidic lime hit, which we got from the juice. Therefore, the conclusion is if you are using juice, the difference should have been much lower, and I've got to really look at trying to lay my hands on some actual lime puree. Lesson number 8 is worth a quick mention. It has been true for the last couple of brews. That is the 30-minute boil, which seems to work perfectly and does reduce some of the volumes that you need. Lesson number 9 was that Kveik Lutra yeast, which absolutely ripped through fermentation and actually reached the 1.019 target at 3 AM in the morning, which I wasn't there to actually see. It was 9 AM before I finally moved it, and it had already dropped to 1.013. It really was fermenting at a rate of knots. Lesson number 10 was the trub loss. Now, we lost 1.4 litres in trub. This did cause me a secondary problem, which I seemed to stall fermentation by actually racking it off at that point. And I wanted to rack it off because I wanted to create 2 separate strands, you know, the with lime and the without. I wish I had left the trub in, or at least some of the trub in. That would have helped fermentation to complete. And for the final lesson learned is the hydrometer versus the refractometer, something I've been keeping an eye on and taking recordings for. This time, the recordings seemed to come out much closer and were within 1 gravity point difference for most of the readings. That was great news. Maybe I've finally got the hang of it. that is it for the lessons learned and for the retrospective as a whole. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Please do like and subscribe, and please do comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And a final thank you to the G-Town brewer who provided this recipe in the first place. Cheers everyone, like and subscribe, and good health. Very nice.